The ground trembled beneath the thunderous gallop of 10,000 horses as they crested the hill overlooking the Volga River. At the head of this seemingly endless stream of mountain warriors rode Batakhan, grandson of the great Genghis Khan, his eyes fixed on the distant walls of Bulgar, the first jewel in his crown of conquest. The morning mist clung to the river's surface like ghostly fingers, but nothing could obscure the terrible magnificence of the Mongol horde that had come to reshape the destiny of Eastern Europe. It was the winter of 1236, and the bitter cold that had claimed so many armies before seemed to energize these sons of the steppes. Each warrior's breath formed crystalline clouds in the frigid air, their composite bows secured at their sides, arrows rattling in their quivers with the rhythm of their horses' hooves. Behind Batakhan rode the legendary general, a man whose tactical genius had already carved the Mongol Empire's name into the annals of history from China to Persia. The Volga Bulgars, prosperous traders who had grown fat on the wealth of the great river, had no comprehension of the storm that was about to engulf them. Their fortified cities and merchant princes had known peace for generations, their armies more suited to ceremonial parades than the brutal reality of steppe warfare. As the Mongol scouts reported back to Batakhan, their intelligence painted a picture of a realm ripe for conquest, wealthy, divided, and utterly unprepared for the fury of the Golden Horde. In 1235, Bato with the great general Sabati began an invasion westwards, first conquering the Bashkirs and then moving on to Volga Bulgaria in 1236. The systematic nature of their advance spoke to the methodical planning that had made Mongols the most feared military force in the known world. Each tribe, each city, each principality fell like dominoes in a carefully orchestrated campaign that would ultimately stretch from the Volga to the gates of Vienna. The Mongol war machine that descended upon Eastern Europe was unlike anything the medieval world had ever witnessed. These were not mere raiders seeking plunder, but the advance guard of a new order, one that would reshape the political landscape of an entire continent. Their horses, bred for endurance on the endless steppes, could cover distances that European knights thought impossible. Their tactics, honed through generations of warfare against the great powers of Asia, combined mobility with devastating firepower in ways that medieval European warfare had never encountered. As Batakhan raised his hand and the great host began its descent toward the Volga, the fate of Eastern Europe hung in the balance. The golden banners of the horde snapped in the winter wind, and the sound of their war drums echoed across the frozen landscape like thunder from the gods themselves. The age of Mongol dominance in Eastern Europe was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. The siege of Bulgar began not with the crash of siege engines, but with the whistle of arrows darkening the winter sky. Batakhan's forces had surrounded the great trading city like a tightening noose. Their siegecraft, learned from Chinese engineers and Persian architects, now put to devastating use against the wealthy merchants who had built their fortunes on the Volga trade routes watched in horror as their seemingly impregnable walls crumbled under the methodical assault of the Mongol war machine. Sabbatai, the master tactician who had orchestrated victories across 2 continents, deployed his forces with surgical precision. The Mongols did not simply attack, they psychologically dismantled their enemies' will to resist. Refugees fleeing from smaller settlements brought tales of entire populations vanishing, of cities reduced to ash and bone. The psychological warfare was as effective as their military prowess. By the time the Mongols reached a major target, half the battle was already won through terror. The fall of Bulgar in late 1236 marked more than just a military victory. It represented the complete collapse of an entire civilization. The Volga Bulgars, who had once been the bridge between the Islamic world and the pagan tribes of the north, found their merchant princes fleeing westward with whatever treasures they could carry. Their armies, trained for border skirmishes and caravan protection, dissolved before the disciplined fury of the Mongol cavalry charges. The vast Mongolian Great Khanate army of around 120,000 mounted archers, commanded by Batakhan and Sabbatai, crossed the Volga River and invaded Volga Bulgaria in late 1230s. The numbers alone were staggering, a force larger than most European kingdoms could field, moving with the speed and coordination that only the Mongol military system could achieve. This was not merely an invasion, it was a migration of warriors, an entire people on the move, carrying their families, their herds, and their destiny across the frozen landscapes of Eastern Europe. The Mongol method of warfare was as much about assimilation as destruction. Those who surrendered were often incorporated into the growing empire, their skills and knowledge adding to the Mongol war machine. Engineers, craftsmen, and administrators found themselves serving new masters, their expertise redirected toward the conquest of their former neighbors. The Mongol Empire grew not just through conquest but through the systematic absorption of the civilizations it encountered. As winter deepened and the Volga froze solid, Batakhan's forces used the ice as a highway, their hardy steppe ponies sure-footed where European war horses would have struggled. The rivers that had been barriers to previous invaders became avenues of conquest for the Mongols. They moved like shadows across the white landscape, appearing at the gates of cities that thought themselves safe behind winter's protection. The remnants of the Volga Bulgar resistance made their final stand at the confluence of the great river and its tribute, but even nature seemed to conspire against them. The frozen ground that made cavalry charges impossible for European knights was perfect terrain for the Mongol ponies. Bred for centuries on the steppes of Central Asia, by the time spring arrived, the Volga Bulgars had ceased to exist as an independent power, their lands incorporated into the growing dominion of the Golden Horde. The spring thaw of 1237 brought more than melting snow. It brought the thunder of Mongol hooves as Bethokon's forces swept southward into the steppe lands of the Ku. These nomadic warriors, who had themselves been the terror of their sedentary neighbors, now found themselves facing a force that made their own raids seem like children's games. The Cumans, known throughout Eastern Europe for their skilled horsemanship and deadly archery, discovered that they had met their match in the form of the Mongol war machine. The Cuman Kankatian, a warrior whose name had struck fear into the hearts of Byzantine emperors and Russian princes alike, watched his confederation of tribes scatter before the methodical advance of the Golden Horde. Unlike the settled peoples who could retreat behind walls, the Cumans had nowhere to hide on the open steppe. Their traditional tactics of hit-and-run warfare proved useless against an enemy who could outrun them, outshoot them, and outmaneuver them on their own terrain. The great migration that followed was unprecedented in European history. Tens of thousands of Cuman families, driving their herds and carrying their portable wealth, began a desperate flight westward. They poured across the borders of the Kingdom of Hungary, begging for sanctuary from King Bela IV. Behind them, the Mongol scouts reported their movements to Batacon, who understood that allowing this massive population to escape would only strengthen his future enemies. The systematic destruction of Cuman resistance took only months, but its implications would reshape the political map of Eastern Europe. The Mongols did not simply defeat the Cumans. They absorbed these survivors into their own forces, adding their knowledge of local terrain and their warrior skills to the growing might of the Golden Horde. Those who refused to submit were hunted down across the vast steppes, their camps burned and their people scattered to the winds. As news of the Cuman collapse reached the principalities of Rus, panic began to spread among the ruling classes. The Russian princes, who had spent generations fighting among themselves over trade routes and tribute rights, suddenly found themselves facing an existential threat. The Mongols had not simply conquered their neighbors. They had systematically eliminated the buffer states that had protected Rus from the full fury of steppe warfare. The city of Ryazan, easternmost of the major Russian principalities, began hastily strengthening its defenses as refugees brought increasingly desperate tales of the Mongol advance. Prince Yuri II of Ryazan called upon his brother princes for aid, but the fractured nature of Rus politics meant that each principality was more concerned with its own survival than with mounting a unified defense. The stage was set for the greatest catastrophe in Russian history. By the autumn of 1237, Batacon's forces had reached the borders of Rus proper, the great forests that had long protected the Russian principalities from steppe. Raiders now became corridors of conquest for the Mongol army. Their Chinese siege engineers had taught them to adapt their tactics to forested terrain, while their reconnaissance network, built from submitted tribes and captured locals, provided them with detailed intelligence about every stronghold and every defensive position. The fate of Eastern Europe now hung in the balance as the two great military traditions, the heavy cavalry and fortified cities of medieval Rus against the mobile archery and siegecraft of the Mongol Empire, prepared for their ultimate confrontation. The golden banners of the Horde cast long shadows across the landscape, and the sound of their war drums echoed through the forests like the heartbeat of destiny itself. The walls of Ryazan had never seemed so fragile as they did on that frozen morning in December 1237, when the Mongol host appeared on the horizon like a dark tide. Prince Yuri II stood atop the city's highest tower, watching through the morning mist as what seemed like an endless sea of warriors deployed across the snow-covered fields surrounding his capital. The sight that greeted him was unlike anything in Russian military experience, a disciplined army that moved with the precision of a single organism, their siege engines already being assembled with practiced efficiency. The Mongol siege of Ryazan was a masterpiece of military engineering that combined Eastern and Western techniques in ways that the defending Russians had never encountered. Chinese siege engineers, captured during the Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty, worked alongside Persian specialists and even some European engineers who had been absorbed into the Mongol war machine during their Western campaigns. The result was a siege that pressed the defenders from every conceivable angle, using technologies that would not reach Western Europe for another century. Prince Yuri had sent desperate messages to his fellow princes, begging for the relief force that never came. The fragmented nature of Rus politics, which had seemed like a strength during times of peace, now revealed itself as a fatal weakness. Prince Yuri II of Vladimir, despite sharing a name with the defender of Ryazan, was more concerned with protecting his own territories than with mounting a costly relief expedition. The other princes followed suit, each convinced that the storm would pass them by if they simply avoided drawing attention to themselves. The psychological warfare that preceded the actual assault was as devastating as the physical siege. Mongol messengers arrived under flags of truce, offering terms that seemed generous: submission in exchange for local autonomy, tribute in exchange for protection. But the stories told by refugees made it clear that Mongol promises were written in sand. Those who had submitted elsewhere had often found themselves facing demands that grew ever more onerous, their populations subjected to systematic deportation, and their warriors pressed into service against their former neighbors. The final assault on Ryazan came with the precision of a surgeon's knife and the brutality of a executioner's axe. The Mongol siege engines, protected by mobile shields and towers, had systematically reduced sections of the wall to rubble when the breach was finally opened. The assault that followed was not the wild charge of barbarian raiders, but the methodical advance of professional soldiers, who had perfected their craft across 2 continents. Prince Yuri II died sword in hand, fighting from the steps of his own cathedral, as the Mongol warriors poured through the streets of his burning capital. The sack of Ryazan was thorough and systematic. Mongols had learned from their Chinese advisors the importance of completely destroying resistance in order to discourage future rebellion. By the time the flames died down, Ryazan had ceased to exist as anything more than a name in the chronicles of Horde. The fall of Ryazan sent shockwaves through the remaining principalities of Rus. The message was clear: the traditional Russian military system, based on heavy cavalry and fortified cities, was no match for the Mongol war machine. The speed of Ryazan's collapse, barely a week from the beginning of the siege to the final destruction, demonstrated that the Mongols were not merely another steppe raiding party, but a revolutionary military force that had rendered traditional medieval warfare obsolete. As the smoke from burning Ryazan darkened the winter sky, Batu Khan's forces were already moving toward their next targets. The systematic conquest of Rus had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The golden banners of the Horde moved westward through the snow-covered forests, carrying with them the destiny of a continent and the doom of a civilization. The wooden walls of Moscow had never been intended to withstand the kind of siege that arrived at its gates in the bitter winter of Young Prince Vladimir Yurievich, nephew of the fallen Prince Yuri of Ri, watched from the ramparts as the Mongol army deployed with the same methodical precision that had become their hallmark. The city that would one day become the heart of a great empire was then merely a fortified trading post. Its wooden palisades and earthwork defenses pitiful barriers against the sophisticated siegecraft of the Golden Horde. The Mongol siege of Moscow revealed the full evolution of their military system since the days of Genghis Khan. Chinese engineers had taught them to construct siege engines that could function in the frozen conditions of the Russian winter, while Persian specialists had shown them how to adapt their tactics to the forested terrain of the north. The result was a siege that combined the mobility of steppe warfare with the methodical destruction of settled civilization. The defenders of Moscow had learned from the fate of Ryazan, but knowledge without power proved useless. Prince Vladimir had managed to gather a force of several hundred warriors, including refugees from the fallen principality, but they faced an enemy that numbered in the tens of thousands. The Mongol forces that surrounded Moscow were not simply raiders seeking plunder, but the advance guard of a new order that intended to reshape the political landscape of Eastern Europe. The psychological impact of the Mongol presence was as devastating as their military superiority. Refugees from the east brought tales of entire populations vanishing, of cities reduced to ash and bone. The Mongol practice of forcing captives to participate in assaults on their own countrymen meant that each new conquest provided them with fresh troops and intimate knowledge of local defenses. The defenders of Moscow found themselves facing not just foreign invaders but their own former neighbors, now serving under the golden banners of the Horde. The fall of Moscow came swiftly, the wooden walls proving no match for the systematic assault of the Mongol siege engines. The city's strategic location on the Moskva River made it an important prize, but its relative weakness meant that the siege was brief and decisive. Prince Vladimir Yurievich died defending the city's central keep, his body found beneath a pile of Mongol arrows that testified to the fierce resistance he had mounted. The sack of Moscow was thorough but not completely destructive there. Mongols had learned to preserve infrastructure that could serve their administrative needs. The city's merchants and craftsmen were spared if they submitted their skills too valuable to waste in an orgy of destruction. This policy of selective preservation would become a hallmark of Mongol rule, creating a class of collaborators who helped maintain the empire's administrative structure. With Moscow fallen, the road to Vladimir lay open before Batu Khan's forces. The Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir, the most powerful ruler in northern Rus, finally understood that the Mongol threat could not be ignored or wished away. The fate of Ryazan and Moscow had demonstrated that the traditional Russian strategy of hiding behind walls and waiting for winter to defeat the invaders would not work against these new enemies. The advance on Vladimir marked the climax of the Mongol conquest of Rus. The city was not merely another principality to be conquered but the symbolic heart of Russian power, the seat of the Grand Prince who claimed supremacy over all the Russian lands. Its fall would represent not just a military victory, but the complete collapse of the Russian political system that had emerged from the ruins of Kievan Rus. As the Mongol host moved through these snow-covered forests toward Vladimir, their Chinese siege engines adapted for winter warfare, their Persian engineers calculating the best approaches to the city's defenses. The fate of Eastern Europe hung in the balance. The golden banners of the Horde cast long shadows across the landscape, and the sound of their war drums echoed through the forests like the heartbeat of a new age being born in blood and fire. The ancient city of Kiev, mother of Russian cities and jewel of the Dnieper, had stood for centuries as the bridge between the Byzantine Empire and the barbarian north. Its golden-domed churches and bustling markets had witnessed the rise and fall of princes, the coming of Christianity to the Slavic lands, and the flowering of the civilization that called itself Rus. But in the autumn of 1240, as Batukon's forces approached across the steppes, Kiev faced its greatest trial and its ultimate destruction. The siege of Kiev was unlike any that had come before in the Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe. This was not merely another principality to be added to the growing empire, but the symbolic heart of an entire civilization. The city's massive walls, built of stone rather than wood, had been strengthened over generations to resist the raids of steppe nomads. Its defenders, led by Prince Mikhail of Chernigov and the warrior boyar Dmitry, represented the flower of Russian chivalry, men who had chosen to make their final stand at the ancient capital rather than flee westward like so many of their peers. Juchi predeceased his father in 1227, but his son Batu expanded their domain in a series of brilliant campaigns that included the sacking and burning of the city of Kiev in 1240. The methodical nature of Batakon's approach to Kiev demonstrated how the Mongol military system had evolved since the early days of the conquest. Chinese siege engineers had perfected techniques for breaching stone walls, while the systematic devastation of the surrounding countryside ensured that no relief force could reach the beleaguered city. The final assault on Kiev came with the fury of a winter storm and the precision of a master craftsman. The Mongol siege engines, protected by mobile towers and shields, had systematically reduced sections of the ancient walls to rubble. When the breach was finally opened, the assault that followed was not the wild charge of barbarian raiders, but the methodical advance of professional soldiers who had perfected their craft in the conquest of empires. The golden domes of Kiev's churches, which had gleamed in the sunlight for centuries, were consumed by flames that could be seen for miles across the steppe. The sack of Kiev was complete and systematic, designed not merely to capture the city but to ensure that it could never again serve as a rallying point for Russian resistance. The Mongols had learned from their Chinese advisors the importance of completely destroying symbolic centers of power. Churches were burned, palaces were razed, and the population was either killed or driven into slavery. The city that had once been the heart of Eastern Slavic civilization was reduced to a collection of ruins scattered along the banks of the Dnieper. The destruction of Kiev marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in European history. The Mongol forces that had swept across the steppes and forests of Eastern Europe now stood at the gates of the West, their scouts already probing the defenses of Hungary and Poland. The medieval world that had emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire suddenly found itself facing a threat that rendered its military systems obsolete and its political structures meaningless. As the smoke from burning Kiev darkened the winter sky, Batukon's forces were already dividing for their next phase of conquest. One army would move northwest toward Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, while another would advance southwest toward Hungary and the Balkans. The European powers that had spent centuries fighting among themselves over trade routes and dynastic claims now faced an enemy that threatened to sweep their entire civilization into the dustbin of history. The golden banners of the Horde moved westward through the snow-covered landscapes, carrying with them the destiny of a continent and the doom of a world. The age of Mongol dominance in Eastern Europe was complete, and ahead lay the ultimate test, the conquest of the West itself. The thunder of their horses' hooves echoed across the frozen steppes like the heartbeat of a new world being born in fire and blood, while behind them lay the ruins of principalities and the ashes of dreams that would never be restored.